Okay, hello again. Thank you for your patience. We're just a couple minutes past the hour and we'd like to begin our webinar for today. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is titled Ontario's Native Freshwater Mussels, Implications for Infrastructure Projects. And this is being presented today by RVA Anderson Associates Limited. The webinar is part of the Ontario Public Works Connects program, and it's organized by the Ontario Public Works Education Committee. My name is Enrico Stradiotto, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. I'm a member of the Education Committee and also serving as the 2021 President of the Ontario Public Works Association. Before we begin, we'd like to say thank you to all our sponsors who help to make events like this possible. We'd like to recognize each of the organizations. Certainly through these challenging times, their support has allowed the chapter to continue bringing value to our membership. To each of these organizations, I'd like to say thank you very much. So for those joining us late, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. A little bit about the organization. OPWA is a non-for-profit organization with over 500 members representing public works practitioners in Ontario. We are the Ontario chapter within the Canadian Public Works Association and a chapter of the American Public Works Association with nearly 30,000 members. We have over 500 members that are represented through the public works or the public sector with many municipalities, as well as consultants and industry sector suppliers, utility companies, and contractors. The chapter is set up with two branches. We have the West Central branch, which is located in the Niagara region, as well as the Ottawa Valley branch in Eastern Ontario. Our mission as a chapter is connecting the public works community. And that's exactly what OPWA offers its members, opportunities to connect through its workshops, conferences, social events, and webinars like today. The Ontario Public Works program is a learning program that is established to connect membership with technical and educational resources, as well as connecting OPWA members with experts or trained people in their field. These monthly webinars over the past year hosted by OPWA is just one example of bringing value to our membership. To learn more about the chapter, you can go to our website and you'll see more about the upcoming events and resources that are available to our members. We would also encourage you, if you would like to participate in further into the chapter's activities, you can join one of our many committees. Your help and assistance is always needed. To the attendees today who are our current members of OPWA, thank you for being a member. If there's anything you need of OPWA, feel free to reach out to our Executive Director, Brian Barber. If you're not a member of OPWA, like this slide is showing you, we would like to have you as a member. Feel free to reach out and ask for more information, and we hope that you can join us as being a member of Ontario Public Works Association. Just some quick notes for today's webinar before we get started. For those of you who've been involved in webinars already, as it's been our life for the last couple of years, your participant microphones and cameras will remain off. Questions will be addressed at the conclusion of the webinar, and we ask you to place your questions into the Q&A box during the webinar. And that can be found by dropping your cursor towards the bottom end of the screen in Zoom, and an icon for Q&A will pop up, and feel free to enter as many questions as possible. I always say the best part sometimes with the webinars are the very specific questions that are being asked by the audience. Today's webinar duration will be 1 hour. So at this time, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Courtney Beneteau. Courtney has been working as a fisheries biologist on infrastructure projects for over 14 years and has been a freshwater mussel specialist for the last 7 years. As a lead freshwater mussel specialist in large and small scale projects, Courtney has experience in designing and carrying out survey programs according to DFO protocols and many more. requirements as needed. She has presented research and given talks on freshwater mussels at a variety of conferences. So with that, I'd like to welcome Courtney.
Thank you very much, Enrico. Thanks for that introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for logging into this OPWA webinar. My name is Courtney Beneteau, and I'm really excited to be talking to you about freshwater mussels today. These animals are such a key component of our local waters, and I find that they're generally not well known. So as Enrico mentioned, I have several years of experience working with freshwater mussels during project design and permitting, but also during construction. Today's presentation has been broken into 4 parts. In part 1, it's all about mussels. These are fascinating animals, and the more you know about something, the more familiar it is, the more that you care. Part 2 focuses on the legislation that protects mussels and how relocations are performed. Part 3 is brief, highlighting some interesting work that's being done with mussels. And lastly, in part 4, I'll provide a project overview and go over some common project scenarios. So my primary goal today is to bring awareness to freshwater mussels, their existence, how amazing they are, how we rely on them and don't even realize it to perform ecosystem services, and also what we can do to protect them in our infrastructure projects. So I'd like to start by providing you with a clear picture of exactly what a freshwater mussel is. Mussels are bivalve animals, meaning that they have 2 shells joined by a ligament, which allows them to open and close like a hinge. They are filter feeders, and they're found in marine and freshwater environments. So my work focuses on freshwater mussels, not the marine mussels like the blue mussel that you can buy at the grocery store. Well, we don't eat freshwater mussels. Ontario has both native and non-native freshwater mussels. More often than not, when I talk to somebody new about mussels, especially in Ontario, they immediately think of zebra mussels, pictured here on a boat propeller, and here fouling up a water intake pipe. But what I'm really talking about are these native species. These are the animals that I have the privilege of working with. There are several different species of freshwater mussel native to Ontario in this picture in the bucket. There are some major differences between freshwater mussels native to our waters and those that were more recently introduced. So to start, there are 41 species of native mussels in Ontario and only 2 non-native species. The most obvious difference is the use of byssal fibers. So zebra and quagga mussels, they use these clear fibers to secure themselves to solid surfaces like boat propellers, pipes, rocks, and unfortunately, native mussels. Whereas native mussels do not attach themselves, and instead they live freely in the stream bed, almost like a living rock. Another major difference is the use of fish hosts in the native mussel life cycle. I'll explain that in a minute. But despite these differences, one thing that the native and the non-native mussels have in common is their innate ability to filter water. So this is a simple illustration of a freshwater mussel partially buried in the substrate. It's a tad blurry, but it does a good job of displaying some of the anatomical structures that make mussels so interesting. The first thing to note are the siphons. So these are tubes that act as the gastrointestinal and respiratory tracts. The mussel takes in water along with food particles, oxygen, contaminants in one tube, and it releases the water through the other. The second thing to point out is the foot. So this is an organ that actually more closely resembles a tongue, and it's what allows the mussel to burrow and to move. And lastly, when you look at the outside of the shell, you'll notice these transverse ridges or lines. These are annual growth lines, and like growth rings on a tree, these can be used to determine how old a mussel is. So this is an illustration of a freshwater mussel life cycle, showing both how they reproduce and disperse. So here you see 2 adult mussels living in the substrate. Reproduction starts with the males releasing sperm into the water column, which is taken in by downstream females through their siphons. The mussels will keep the fertilized eggs inside special gill pouches until they develop into tiny embryos or larvae about the size of a grain of sand. And this is where it gets interesting. When the larvae are ready to be released, the females of some species will actually go fishing. In these instances, the mussel will push part of her soft tissue outside of the shell and move it around to lure a fish. And some of these lures have evolved to resemble different prey items and attract different fish species. So I have a couple of videos to show you of what that looks like. This video was filmed in the North Thames River. Here you can see a female mussel beating her spotted mantle in an effort to lure a host fish. So this is a wavy rayed lamp mussel. And the second video, also filmed in the North Thames River, shows some of the color and shape variations in mussel lures. So this mussel looks very similar to the previous video in the spotting and the coloration. But as the camera pans out, that's a rock. Here's a mussel. With this, you see the red mantle there. So these are two mussels. They're less than a meter apart, and the mantles look so different. And yet these are actually the same species. So when the fish comes near, the mussel releases her embryos, which are called glochidia, in a cloud. And each one looks like a little Pac-Man. And it must attach to the gills or fins of the fish in order to complete its larval development. So these tiny mussel larvae clamp onto the fish and they live as a parasite for several weeks, moving with the fish wherever it goes. And it stays on the fish until it's metamorphosed into a tiny juvenile mussel. And then it drops off, it settles into the river bottom where it grows into an adult mussel and starts the cycle all over again. So this is how mussels disperse upstream. They hitchhike on fish. If it weren't for the parasitic stage, the juveniles would just be broadcast into the current and the mussels would only flow downstream. So kidney shells are a type of mussel. They use a different type of lure to attract fish. Instead, their glochidia are enclosed in membrane capsules called ovisacs, which mimic host prey such as a larval insects or larval fish. There's an adhesive tail that attaches these capsules to rocks after they're released from the female mussel. And then the water movements cause the ovisacs to move, which just increases the attractiveness to the host fish, which is primarily darters. And then when the fish bites the capsule, it ruptures, releasing glochidia, which attach to the gills of the host. So this is a video by Chris Barnhart recorded at Missouri State University. It shows a lampsilus mussel luring the bass. It's great because you can see that cloud of glochidia being released. And I also really like this video because it goes in and shows the microscopic view of these glochidia clamping down onto the gills. And it goes further to show you how the glochidia insist in the gills and they grow for several weeks, maturing into juvenile mussels that will then fall off the fish and start their life cycle. So as if that wasn't complicated enough, some mussel species have evolved to only be able to use one species of fish, and this would be their obligate host. These are a couple of examples of mussel species with obligate fish hosts. So the snuff box is an interesting mussel. The females of this species actually clamp onto the head of the log perch, holding onto the fish while she releases her glochidia. So if you've ever seen a log perch, you know that they have a longish snout and they're a bit larger than the darters that they're usually hanging around. Amazingly, if a snuff box were to clamp down on some of these darter species, the mussel could crush their skulls and then the fish would die, and then her glochidia would also die without a host. So she has to be able to sense that the fish that's rooting around in the rocks nearby is a log perch in order to successfully complete her life cycle. The other example here is the salamander mussel. This mussel lives only under flat rocks and uses only mud puppies as a host. So a mud puppy is not actually a fish, it's a salamander. And it's a salamander that lives underwater and burrows under flat rocks. The salamander mussel is the only mussel in Canada to use a host species that's not a fish. So these mussel images are from the Federal Combined Recovery Strategy because sadly, both of these mussel specialists are endangered. So this is another video from Chris Barnhart. And in this close-up shot of the mussel, you can see her lure. It's inside the shell, and it kind of looks like a caddisfly larvae, but you can see it moving around in there. And then as a log perch comes by and the snuff box senses it, she clamps down. So keep in mind that the fish isn't being hurt, it's just being held. I mean, it's not in the mussel's best interest to injure the fish. She wants it to live so that her glochidia can then live. So why are mussels so important? Well, they spend their lives half buried in the sediment, stabilizing riverbeds and preventing erosion. They also have important cultural value to indigenous communities around the world. They serve as food for birds and muskrats and otters. And when they die, their shells are adopted as secondhand homes by crayfish and aquatic insects. But most importantly, mussels filter water, up to 50 liters per mussel per day. They live off of the algae and the plankton from this filter feeding, and in the process, they remove the particulate matter and toxic substances from the water, including some heavy metals, harmful bacteria, pharmaceuticals, and PCBs. So they provide this direct link between the benthic and the pelagic food webs, contributing to nutrient cycling by taking the soluble nutrients from the water column and then secreting them into the substrate and making them bioavailable for other aquatic plants and organisms. North America has the greatest diversity of freshwater mussel species in the world, with 300 native species. So we kind of live in this special place, like with regards to freshwater mussels. And to put this into perspective, there are more mussel species in the Grand River than found in all of the lakes and rivers in Europe combined. In Canada, there are 55 species, and we have 41 of these in Ontario, 15 of which are at risk. Meaning that they're in danger of disappearing from the wild. Actually, quite sadly, freshwater mollusks are the most imperiled group of animals worldwide. So to put that into perspective, the Nature Conservancy reports that nearly 70%, so that's 70% of mussels in North America are extinct or imperiled, compared to 16% of mammals and 15% of bird species. So what is it that's threatening our native mussels? Habitat degradation, pollution. Downstream of many wastewater treatment plants are considered dead zones with little dissolved oxygen where there are no mussels. Siltation, sediment and sediment spills can smother a mussel bed. Habitat fragmentation, anything that restricts the movement of fish directly restricts the ability of mussels to complete their life cycle. So mussel habitat is wet year round. So changes in water levels also affect where they can survive. And invasive species. This picture perfectly illustrates the difference between native freshwater mussels and non-natives. So here you see a native mussel encrusted with zebra mussels. Where they overlap, invasive species are outcompeting natives. They're covering over their habitats and they're literally choking them out. So these are the current threats, but I'd like to share a quick story from the past. In 1889, German immigrant J.P. Balpol introduced the pearl button to the US. So 10 years later, 60 button factories lined the banks of the Mississippi near Muscatine, Iowa. It was an economic boom. Mussel camps sprung up overnight. There was a flotilla of shanty boats covered over the mussel beds. And in 1907, the US Bureau of Fisheries stepped in to try and protect the industry. But sadly, at that time, the solution wasn't to regulate the clamming, but it was to propagate more mussels. But they soon found out that the issue wasn't raising up the juvenile mussels to release them in the river. The problem was actually the Industrial Revolution and the changes in agricultural practices that were polluting and silting up the river so bad that the juveniles couldn't survive. And then by 1930, the Bureau ended their mussel propagation program and urged the industry to go out and harvest any remaining mussels before they were killed by the silt pollution. Around that same time in the 1880s, Ontario had its own pearl button industry on both the Thames and Grand Rivers. Estimates of hundreds of tons of mussels were harvested each year from these watersheds into the 1940s. Berlin, Ontario, which is now Waterloo region, had a thriving button industry with 5 local factories, one pictured here. But these factories too closed down in the 1940s with the influx of cheap plastic buttons and the introduction of the zipper. So now I'd like to switch gears to talk about how mussels are considered during infrastructure projects. So how do you know that there are mussels in your project area? Typically, this information is determined through background review. This includes previous studies in the area or public databases like iNaturalist, which is pictured here. So this is a map of Ontario showing all of the freshwater mussel records highlighted. Also, some conservation authorities will list fish and mussel species on their watershed report cards, but that does tend to be more general, more of a sub-watershed level. Other common ways to learn about mussels in your area is through consultation with environmental agencies or during a natural heritage assessment. But oftentimes, aquatic assessments don't specify a targeted mussel survey, but anybody with experience will note mussel shells or even identify live mussels in stream. And then they can include that information in their reporting for consideration during the project impact analysis phase. So this map from the DFO shows the distribution of species richness in Canada. Species richness meaning the number of species found in a given area. And keeping in mind that there are only 55 species recorded across the country. Looking a bit closer at Southern Ontario, you really get a sense of just how important this area is for biodiversity. So looking at this map, it's probably safe to assume that if your project is near water in Southern Ontario, freshwater mussels should probably be considered. So with specific regard to species at risk, this is another public database and search tool that's available on the DFO website. It's their aquatic species at risk mapping. So you can zoom into your project area and using the Find Aquatic Species at Risk tool, you can delineate an area on the map and search the database for records. So on this image, you can see a map of downtown London with a point search at the fork of the Thames River. So this tool returns data on both fish and mussel species at risk and the critical habitat, which is also protected under species at risk legislation. Other places that you can look to find mussel species at risk distribution data include the SAR Public Registry, canada.ca, and SAR in Ontario at ontario.ca. You can also check out the COSEWIC reports, recovery strategies, management plans, the government response statements for more information. And these photos down here, these are pictures of some examples of those noted documents. So now let's say that you know that there are mussels in your study area. Let's talk about the approvals and permits that may be required for your project. So unfortunately, there's just not enough time to go through each piece of legislation in detail. Assuming that you'll have a qualified professional to help you navigate these legislative processes, what I hope that you can take away from this presentation is enough information to ask questions of your environmental colleagues and service providers. So all mussels and mussel habitat are protected under the Fisheries Act. This prohibits the death of fish, the harmful alteration, disruption, and destruction of fish habitat, or HAD. And please note that mussels are included in the definition of fish under the Fisheries Act. So this is administered by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and they're concerned with projects near water, which includes riparian habitats generally 30 meters from the annual high water mark of a watercourse. So when working under the Act, there are some common project activities like beaver dam removal and culvert maintenance that are covered by standard codes of practice. So these are essentially BMPs with a notification process. But outside of these, if your project has potential to impact mussel habitat, you should be submitting a request for review to the DFO for guidance. Ultimately, the DFO will decide if the project as described is likely to cause the death of mussels or HAD to mussel habitat or not. If not, they will issue a letter of advice and the project may proceed. But if the death or HAD is likely, then they'll encourage you to develop an offsetting plan, and submit an application for the authorization under the Fisheries Act. Also in Ontario, all mussels are protected under the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act. This is administered by the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources and Forestry, which was previously the MNRF, and a permit is required to collect mussels. So in Ontario, mussel species at risk are protected under the Federal Species at Risk Act and the Provincial Endangered Species Act. So whenever you submit a request for review, the DFO will already be considering your project for compliance under SARA. SARA prohibits the killing, harming, possessing, or collecting of listed species, and it also prohibits damage or destruction of their residences. The Endangered Species Act is administered by the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. This act also prohibits the killing and damage to the habitat of listed species. And under the ESA, there are several mussel species and specific project activities that fall under the Aquatic Species Exemption. So this is also a type of registration process that includes a mitigation plan and mandatory monitoring. But outside of that, the three most common permits under the ESA are health or safety, protection or recovery, or overall benefit. So those are the laws that protect mussels. And these are the documents that contain the approved survey and relocation protocols in Ontario. So the DFO protocol for the detection and relocation of freshwater mussel species at risk in Ontario described the methodology for relocating and monitoring mussel SAR. Both protocols include survey methods that can be used during the design of a project where mussel information is lacking, or where surveys may be requested by permitting agencies. Depending on where your study area is and what the potential SAR you may encounter, there are some potential permits that you'll need to complete a mussel survey. So you'll always need a license to collect fish for scientific purposes, or a scientific collector permit issued by the MNRF. Then there are permits under the federal and provincial species at risk legislations. Please keep in mind that the DFO typically does not issue permits to allow sampling of known SAR populations. So if the DFO mapping indicates that SAR mussels are in a stretch of stream, you're not likely to be permitted to sample in that area. But every site is different, so you can always consult with the agencies to discuss specific projects and what's required. And timing is important. Like as with any living organism, from plants to insects to bears, when you look for them greatly affects your ability to detect them. So since mussels are found in such a wide variety of freshwater habitats, ranging from deep lake and shoreline to rivers, large and small, there are different types of surveys that can be used based on the environment. So in shallow or wadable streams, you can employ a visual timed search with viewers, or you can perform a more quantitative survey using a quadrat sampling and excavation. For deeper water, if the water is clear, like in a lake, snorkeling can be used. But if the visibility is low, like more like in a wetland, tactile searching with scuba equipment or the use of long-handled mussel scoops can be employed. So another type of experimental survey method would be sampling for environmental DNA or eDNA. So these different types of surveys produce varying degrees of mussel data. So this includes things like species presence absence, relative abundance, density, size, class distributions, and sex ratios. Now I'd like to shift gears slightly and focus on mussel relocations. So a common thread to all species at risk permits issued for projects with potential to impact mussels is the requirement to relocate mussels following federal protocols. So in addition to the relocation itself, this generally includes the requirement for a qualified, experienced professional and a post-relocation monitoring program. So not just anyone should be performing species at risk mussel relocations. Now, the language on this slide is just an example from a recent proposal identifying the requirements for that project for a freshwater mussel specialist. But any SAR relocation should be carried out by a qualified professional with experience in identifying freshwater mussels and designing survey programs and sampling mussel populations. This person should also have experience collecting, compiling, analyzing data, and then synthesizing that data into meaningful results for population monitoring. They should also have an understanding of species at risk legislation and even have experience in obtaining these permits. So the area from which mussels need to be removed and relocated from includes the in-water work area and the surrounding buffer. Together, this is described as the prescribed search area, or the PSA. So this figure is from the DFO protocol, and it shows the different zones of a PSA. So the activity zone is the area of direct impacts, or the work area. Outside of that is a risk zone. So this is an area that still has maybe a moderate potential to be impacted by the work, and this is the work zone. And then lastly, the PSA also includes a zone of influence. And so this is an area downstream where indirect impacts like sedimentation may occur. So the PSA is where the mussels are removed from, and then these animals need to be relocated to a safe site, generally upstream. And it's important that the relocation site habitats are similar to those found in the PSA, things like flow, substrate, and morphology, to help ensure that the translocated mussels can survive in the new location. The third area involved in a mussel relocation is called the control site. So mussels from this area are also collected, but they're returned and no new individuals are relocated there. So to give you a visual of what this looks like, let's say that there's work happening at the red line. Then this might be our prescribed search area. Before the work, the mussels need to be collected, measured, tagged, and photographed, and then relocated to here, the relocation site. So I should note that before any PSA mussels can be put into the relocation site, the area needs to be searched for mussels. These also need to be collected, measured, tagged, and then returned along with the PSA transplants. And then in order to be able to measure any effects of the relocated mussels on the population native to that relocation site, a control site needs to be established where the mussels will receive the same treatment, but no new individuals. So according to the DFO protocol, mussels are non-thermoregulators, and they should not be disturbed when temperatures are low and their mobility is impaired, because this could increase the mussel's vulnerability to predation or to being swept downstream due to slower re-anchoring capabilities. So for this reason, mussel relocations take place when the water temperatures exceed 16 degrees, usually starting in June and extending until September. You also have to take into consideration that the initial relocation activities should be completed in time to allow the post-relocation monitoring of these individuals after 30 days to happen while the water is still above that temperature threshold. So this allows the redisturbed mussels to then re-anchor in the stream bed before the temperature drops. So this slide is just to give a quick description of some of the equipment used for collecting mussels in a relocation. So a quadrat, which is basically a 1 meter square tube, a sieve box, which is a wood frame with a 1/4 inch mesh, an underwater viewer, a long handle mussel scoop, measuring tape, ropes and stakes, a screened bucket or live well, and for deeper areas, a boat and scuba gear. But really the most used tool in collecting mussels is your hands. This type of tactile searching is also known as raccooning because it mimics how raccoons will like search a riverbed for mussels to eat. So every site is different. So the methodology and the process in the protocol is adapted to ensure that the entire river bottom in the PSA is surveyed. To do this, the PSA is measured and marked out using stakes and ropes. In a wadable stream, like in the picture, the team would line up along the transect line with their 1 meter quadrats and systematically excavate and sieve the top 10 centimeters of substrate. So the figure inset on that picture is also from the protocol, and it shows the best way to fully search a 1 meter square. So it's important to view each of these squares before and after searching. Then any mussels that are collected are deposited into a screened basket in the river until they can be processed. So for deeper areas where the water is deeper than 1 meter, the transects can be searched by a scuba dive team. This is a quick video showing how the sieve box works. You put in the substrate and the fines wash through, and what's left on the screen are rocks and mussels. So this is a wavy rayed lamp mussel, which is a species at risk. So depending on the number of mussels being collected from a site really dictates the frequency of mussel processing to avoid the effects of overcrowding or smothering in the holding bucket. So when I say process, what I mean is IDing, measuring, tagging, and photographing. So this picture shows the basic equipment required to do those things. First off, this is the mussel. This is a shellfish tag being held with tweezers. We use crazy glue to adhere the tags to each of the 2 mussel shells. We use calipers to measure the maximum length, height, and width of each mussel. And all species at risk are photographed, and typically at least one of each non-SAR species. So I'll show you what those typical photo vantage points are like on the next slide. But you typically photograph any interesting morphologies or anomalies, and all in all, the mussels only out of the water for less than 2 minutes. So these 3 smaller pictures show the standard vantages for photographing a mussel. And the 2 larger photos on the left were an interesting fluted shell that was recently collected in the Grand River. The Grand can be quite rocky, and I just thought it was so cool to imagine that this mussel fell off a fish when it was tiny, and it settled into the cobble to live and grow, suspended in its surroundings. It's like an extreme example of how our environment shapes us. So the tagged mussels in the relocation and control sites are monitored for survival and growth after 1 month, 1 year, and 2 years, with reports being sent to the DFO. So that initial monitoring event is an opportunity to assess any immediate impacts, and it provides us with an opportunity to mitigate. So for example, fencing off an area from cattle access. The longer term impacts of the relocation are assessed after 1 and 2 years by things like changes in growth rates and mortalities. So part 3 is relatively short, maybe more for interest and maybe to get us thinking about possibilities for the future. Some of the federal recovery strategies and action plans have identified captive breeding programs to help achieve recovery objectives for endangered freshwater mussels in Canada. So knowing now about the complex life cycle, you can appreciate how captive breeding of these species may be challenging. In Ontario, the MNRF's fish culture section has 2 provincial hatcheries where they've been experimenting for years with freshwater mussel propagation and rearing, but have not begun releasing mussels to the wild. So these photos were provided by Christopher Wilson. He's the project leader for the mussel work in the fish culture section. While the propagation activities at the stations are currently on hold, the researchers are continuing to rear up the mussels in an outdoor pond setup, like what's pictured here, and monitor them as they begin to sexually mature. So if you remember from the button slide, the US has a long history of mussel propagation. So it's my understanding that there are quite a few mussel hatcheries in the US with ongoing release programs. An interesting example I came across recently is in Pennsylvania, where the Infrastructure Investment Authority has agreed to fund a nearly $8 million freshwater mussel hatchery with the intent of reestablishing not only species at risk, but also common species in the Delaware and Susquehanna River basins. So it's a bit of a twofold benefit, really. The depleted mussel populations are getting restored, and the city is banking on improved water quality and potentially lower water treatment costs. So kind of continuing with this idea, according to a 2014 Stanford study that was published in Environmental Science and Technology, researchers subjected native California floater mussels and invasive Asian clams to wastewater treated with various concentrations of CECs. CECs, or contaminants of emerging concern, such as pharmaceuticals, herbicides, and flame retardants, are found in municipal wastewater. They're also found in agricultural runoff and animal wastes, and they don't break down easily when they reach streams or other waterways. So in the study, after only 72 hours, the clams and mussels had removed up to 80% of some of these chemicals. So is just to show you what this really looks like. This is a time-lapse video posted by Eric Hupel. It's of the common blue mussel, which is called Mytilus edulis, which is a marine mussel commonly used in aquaculture, clearing the water in a 10-gallon tank, directly compared to a tank with the same water and no mussels. So this video provides like a great visual to reiterate how all mussels, marine and freshwater, in performing their basic metabolic processes, act to clean the water that they inhabit, and how preserving these animals, and in cases like the Pennsylvania example, reintroducing them, can have a significant positive effect. So the final part of this talk is really aimed at providing you with a project overview and explaining where mussels fit in. So this table shows a general project overview with the project phases down the left column and separate columns for species at risk and non-species at risk mussels. So at the onset of a project, we first identify whether there are watercourses within 30 meters of the project. Then typically it's in the preliminary design phase when species at risk mussels are identified, either through background resources, agency consultation, or through field investigations. In the detailed design phase, when the extent of the project impacts are a bit more fully understood, is when Fisheries Act or Species at Risk permitting and approvals are initiated. In the contract and tender phase, it is important that the Fisheries Act authorization and or SAR permit requirements are clearly articulated. And then prior to in-water construction, mussel relocations are completed under the direction of either the SAR permits and or the scientific collector permit. Post-construction, there's the monitoring of SAR mussels, the 1 month, 1 year, 2 year post-relocation, and or for an ESA registration, the monitoring is 5 years. So at this point, I'd like to note that these processes and requirements are specific to mussels only, and that typically a project near water also falls under the regulation of local conservation authority. So permitting and approvals should be sought to comply with their regulations as well. Sometimes you can come across mussels in a project when they're not expected. So no indication for background information or agency consultation. The best case scenario would be that this happens during the design phases of a project. If SAR mussels are found, field work in the water should stop, the sighting should be reported, and at that point, permitting processes can be initiated. If the mussels discovered are not species at risk, then regardless, at that point, they can be accounted for in the impact assessment and the mitigation plan for the project. In the event that mussels are discovered during construction, you stop work, you'd have the mussels assessed by a qualified biologist. If they are not SAR, a scientific collector permit can be obtained. And I guess more than likely, if in-water work is occurring, this would already be in place. And so this could just be amended to include the mussels. And then the mussels could be salvaged from the work area, similar to a fish salvage. If the mussels are species at risk, then the DFO and the MECP should be contacted immediately to discuss permitting and relocation plans. So this would most likely require an immediate mitigation plan and then also a long-term plan for overall benefit and monitoring. So now I'd like to walk through some common infrastructure project scenarios just to illustrate the decision-making processes when mussels are involved. So the common scenarios that we'll go through are bridge replacement, a new pipeline with riparian impacts, a culvert cleanout, and a culvert replacement with a stream alignment. So here we have scenario one. So this is a bridge replacement with 800 square meters of permanent in-water impacts. So let's assume that there are kidney shells. This is a species at risk mussel listed under both the federal and provincial legislations. So this means that the project would require a permit under Section 73 of the Species at Risk Act. A request for review would be submitted to the DFO to review. Let's assume that they determine that the death of fish or mussels had is likely. So the project would then proceed with the authorization process, which would be an offsetting plan and application. So then from the provincial permitting side, we need to determine if the impact area and the construction methods comply with the ESA exemption and registration. So according to section 23.4, the exemption does not apply to projects that impact more than 100 square meters of habitat below the high water mark. So this project would then proceed with the overall benefit permit process. A species at risk mussel relocation would be required prior to in-water work, and post-relocation monitoring would be required as per the permits. So I guess I hope that by walking through this decision tree, it helps you see where we can kind of alter the fate of a project by, like, for example, limiting the in-water impact area. So for scenario 2, this project involves a new wastewater pipeline that will be installed via directional drilling under a stream. In order to do this, the staging for the drilling equipment will impact 250 square meters of riparian habitat within 30 meters of the watercourse. So let's assume the same mussel species at risk as the last example for comparison. So again, since kidney shell is listed under the Species at Risk Act, the project would require a permit under section 73 of the Species at Risk Act. And due to the SAR and riparian habitat impacts, a request for review would then be submitted to DFO. And let's say that given the limited scope of the impacts and the mitigation plan, we assume that they determined the death of fish in a hat is not likely, and they provide us with a letter of advice to complete the work. So since kidney shell are protected under the ESA, we first need to determine if the impact area and the construction methods comply with that ESA exemption. So according to section 23.4, the exemption may be applied to projects that impact less than 300 square meters of riparian habitat. So assuming that all other criteria of the exemption are met, then this project could proceed with a mitigation plan and project registration. Due to the potential risk of frack out, the mitigation plan would need to include contingency measures for that. So post-construction monitoring would then include the 5-year monitoring plan as per the ESA exemption. And depending on the riparian disturbance proximity, a SAR mussel relocation may be required prior to in-water work. And then a post-relocation monitoring would be required as per the permits. So for scenario 3, we have a culvert cleanout. There are mussels, but no SAR. So does the work meet the criteria listed in the culvert maintenance interim code of practice? So we can confirm that there is no need to realign the watercourse. There's no scour pool infilling required. And assuming that all the other criteria can be met, in that case, we would incorporate the mitigation and protection measures in the culvert maintenance interim code of practice and submit a notification form to DFO 10 days prior to completing the work. So while a mussel salvage may not be required, while it may be required, may not be, there would be no post-construction monitoring requirement. So this is the last scenario. The project in scenario 4 involves a culvert replacement that requires the realignment of 500 linear meters of watercourse. That is also habitat for, let's say, the wavy-rayed lamp mussel. Wavy-rayed lamp mussel is listed under SARA, but it's only listed as special concern. And so it's not afforded the same legal protection under the Species at Risk Act. It is currently listed, however, as threatened under the ESA. So nonetheless, due to the in-water habitat impacts, a request for review would be submitted to DFO. And given the scale of the work, let's assume that there is they just determined that their death of fish or a had is likely. And so the project would proceed with the authorization process. Since the wavy-rayed lamp mussel are protected under ESA, we need to determine if the ESA exemption applies, but we know that it doesn't apply to projects that impact more than 100 square meters below the high water mark. So then this project would proceed to the overall benefit permit process. A species at risk mussel relocation would be required prior to the in-water work, and the post-relocation monitoring would be required as per the permits. So I suppose another way that you could look at the scenario is that there would be star mussels, yes, but provincially listed or protected only. But then the project still needs to be considered under the Fisheries Act, and the impacts to mussels and mussel habitat, and the end result is the same. So this concludes the common project scenario decision process walkthrough. I hope you found it helpful in understanding how and where making changes in design can change the permit requirement outcome. Some other things that we can do during the design of a project that have a big impact on protecting freshwater mussels include focusing on erosion control measures as opposed to sediment controls. This could be things like limiting the timing of ground disturbance and temporary interim erosion controls. Normalize mussel salvages for non-SAR mussels, like we do with fish, to help keep our common species common. Increase riparian buffers around watercourses everywhere you can, and improve habitat for fish, because without fish, there are no mussels. Other ways we can improve water quality for mussels include prioritizing wastewater treatment plant upgrades and separating sanitary and storm sewers, employ water conservation, and support restoration and conservation efforts in sensitive watersheds, like those with freshwater mussels, and continue the conversation. Another simple way that you can help is to report mussel sightings and learn more. I mentioned iNaturalist already. There's also a clam counter app put out by the DFO in collaboration with the Toronto Zoo. It's a great resource. It offers information for beginners, and it has a helpful key to help you ID species. I recommend the photo field guide to freshwater mussels of Ontario. It's used by mussel specialists and the DFO alike. And since invasive mussels are one of the largest threats to our native mussels, there's an invasive species reporting and tracking app called the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping Systems Ontario, which you can contribute to. Report zebra and quagga mussels if you see them, especially in rivers. So in summary, mussels are an interesting and important part of our freshwater ecosystems, and we all have the opportunity to positively impact our environment. So to quote the late Maya Angelou, you do your best until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. So what can you do now? You can share this information with others, keep the conversation going. You can take a walk by a watercourse and have a closer look, and advocate on behalf of freshwater mussels, the silent ecosystem engineers. And with that, I'd like to thank Enrico and the OPWA again for giving me the opportunity and the platform to talk with you today. And thank you for listening. I'll do my best to answer any questions that you may have now. Also, my email's up on the screen, so feel free to reach out if you have any further questions or if you just want to talk mussels.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Courtney. Very interesting. You know, I didn't know actually so much was involved with these little aquatic creatures. I hope you don't think ill of me. When I was a little boy, we used to dig them out of the mud and try to skip them across the top of the water, which probably wasn't a good thing to be doing. So, but I'd like to encourage our attendees to place their questions into our Q&A box. We do have some questions for you, Courtney, and
Okay.
we certainly would encourage more questions from the audience. It is about 4 minutes to 1 o'clock, but we will get to the questions now and just continue on past the hour, and hopefully you can still remain with us through those questions. So let's get started with the first question, Courtney. This comes from Carol. What is the lifespan and what happens to them when they die? Does it cause problems in our waterways with the accumulation of dead shells? Yeah, we'll stop the question there.
Okay. The lifespan varies depending on the species, but some like from say 50 years to 200 years, some live very long. When they die, I think that they just decompose in the water like a dead fish would, really, their tissue. I don't know about that causing a problem in the waterways. Relation of dead shells. I wouldn't think so. I think that their dead shells are used as habitat from other aquatic organisms. So I don't think that their shells cause any problem. No, I think it's a benefit. Yeah.
Okay, great. There was a second question from Carol, and that was, what is the average number of larvae released each time?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh, it's hundreds.
Mm-hmm.
It's a huge cloud of Glaucidia.
It was quite a fascinating process to see what they do in terms of being released and attaching themselves to their to the other fish for development. Very interesting.
It is. It's really cool. You know, the thing about that is that traditionally it's the thought that the mussel Glaucidia living on a fish as a parasite, that it was pretty benign to the fish. But I think that there's research going on now where they're learning that it does affect the fish. As any parasite would, but I mean, it's temporary. It's just, but I think it also depends on the number of Glaucidia that have infested the gills of a single fish. But it does create a bit of I don't know, not an issue for the fish, but a little bit.
Sure, yeah. Now there's one question before any additional people leave is, will a copy of the presentation be available? And maybe what we might suggest here, Courtney, is your information is on the screen and people could contact you directly if they would like a copy of the presentation. Does that work?
Yes, that works for me.
Okay, great. So another question here from Cheryl Ann. You were just talking about the different projects, and how does this process change in the case of an emergency infrastructure repair project?
Well, in an emergency situation is different. It's different permitting, and there are a lot of exemptions required. So
maybe part of that answer, Courtney, if you can provide, it might be the timeline. Is it reduced drastically, or do the permits hold up the process?
Oh no! In a human health or safety exemption, it is like a registration process. It's very quick for the permitting. You know, to the dismay of the mussels, maybe. The relocation may still happen if there's time, but even the DFO has emergency works processes where, you know, if a bridge is going to fall down, you can fix it, and then you just have to try and provide offsetting for the damage, the aquatic damage.
Sure.
After, you know, like kind of after the fact.
Yeah, right. Makes sense. Question from Kelly is, can you advise where we can find a copy of the DFO guidance document outlining protocols and methods for sampling and relocating mussels?
Yeah, I think even if you just Google it, that you can find it. I'm sure that the DFO has it posted on their website somewhere. I'm not exactly sure, but just by Googling that, or Mackey et al. 2008, it'll be one of the first returns.
Okay, that easy. Great.
Yeah.
A question here: what would be the first steps for a municipality to complete when considering adding mussels to assist with cleaning up the water source?
So that's a good question. They would need to consult with the MECP and the DFO about that. I don't know of that being done yet in Ontario. So I love the idea. And I mentioned that the province does have a couple of hatcheries where they were working on propagating and rearing mussels. And the fact that they hadn't been releasing them, I'm not sure. I think that there would be a lot involved in the setup of that, but definitely a worthwhile question to put to these agencies and see, can we start this?
Right. Oh, it was fascinating, the video you had that showed the two aquariums and the cleaning of the water. And I believe that was a time lapse of 51 minutes, was it?
Yeah. It's amazing.
Right. Okay. Next question here, has acidification of our waterways impacted mussel populations that you know of?
That's a good question. That is not something that I've looked into, like research wise. I do know that the like there are impacts from salt, the salt that we use, salt on our highways, like that there are impacts of that. That does impact mussels. I'm sure that acidification would as well. I think that they're definitely affected by low oxygen levels and nitrification. So,
right, okay. Couple last minutes here if anybody wants to send in some additional questions. I'm curious, I have a question of my own, Courtney, just your interest in this area. You've become a specialist with mussels in the last 7 years. What brought you, or what intrigued that interest, initiated that interest at your end?
Well, I started working with fish, and I just working in consulting. We had a linear infrastructure project, and I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Jerry Mackey, like that very first time. And we did a mussel survey together, and then we worked on several projects together after that. And it was him that really got me interested in it. He was a great teacher.
Right. Oh, great. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, so that brings us up to 4 minutes past the hour, and I don't see any additional questions, so we could probably cap things off here, Courtney. I'd just like to, again, thank you on behalf of the Ontario Public Works Association for taking the time to present today. It was a very interesting webinar. I learned a lot about these mussels and obviously their importance in our aquatic habitat. And with that, if any of our attendees have more questions, again, Courtney's information is on screen, and you can certainly get in contact with her directly. And we just have some chats coming in, Courtney saying thank you very much for the informative webinar. So with that, we will say goodbye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Courtney. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of your week.
Thank you, Enrico.